So I'm the VP of Marketing at Kings Isle. For those who don't know me, I've been in the gaming industry for about 16 years. Started with Electronic Arts, moved through a few other places. So I've worked in the industry from HD console and PC through to free-to-play PC and now mobile, largely with a focus on marketing and brand development. So what I'm going to talk about a few things. So first, the platform cycle and what that means about what it takes for games to be successful, why story matters now as a result of that, and then a case study on the impact of story. You'll notice that my slides are not very visually exciting. That's somewhat intentional. I think usually when we start to talk about story in games, we get very enamored of exciting stories and videos and emotion. And what then happens is at some point, you go to the company and someone says, yes, but what's the business case for this? And nobody can answer that question because they've spent all their time creating that cool video. And so it doesn't happen. The game doesn't get made or the story doesn't get integrated because this stuff costs money to make. And so we get games that lack story. So I'm intentionally making my presentation a little boring because I want it to be about how we make the case that it's not just for fun and not just because we love story, but because it's actually a good business idea to include story in your game. So this is what the platform cycle looks like on every platform, whether that's a new console or a completely new type of gaming like VR. Every time, and don't worry about the exact numbers, it's just a visual illustration, every time you see evolution in two areas, the number of games available and the quality of those games. And it starts at the beginning, you have very few games and generally low quality, and by the end you have a huge number of games and many of them of very high quality. So in that launch phase, you have a very few games. You have low average quality and simple mechanics. So this is often where you see, for example, you might see very, very casual games, games that are very quick interaction, games that are quite simple in their execution. It's because there aren't very many games, and because the games are not that high quality, they're often very simple to play, and because at this stage, the platform is not necessarily that big. For example, with a console generation, you're not going to have that much hardware in the market yet. It's usually relatively inexpensive to acquire users, and you can generate a very high organic rate. When you're one of only a few games, the odds that somebody will find your game are much higher. So at this stage, you can win on game quality. If you, in the early days of a new platform, make a high-quality game experience, people will find that game organically. You're not going to get lost. You're actually going to get found, and that's a way you can win. Some examples of this in mobile would be things like Clash of Clans or Candy Crush. They came to the platform very early. As we moved to smartphone, they did high-quality execution, and as a result, they built up huge user bases that gave them a competitive advantage that they still enjoy today. So then we go to this more middle growth stage of platform evolution. As you can imagine, the volumes of games is increasing, so you'll notice some themes here that continue. The quality is improving and you start to see more complex mechanics, so you start to see deeper games, more involved games. Organic discovery starts to become limited. There's a lot of games to choose from at this stage. The chances that someone will just find your game are lower. There may be platform opportunities to present the game. Mass marketing is still possible. So there aren't that many highly successful, highly profitable games at this stage. So if you have a successful game or if you have significant financial backing and you can advertise in a big way, you can get ahead. At this stage, you can win on marketing. So this is the point where game quality is solid enough that if you can put significant marketing behind a game, that game will rise to the top. The example of this in mobile, Game of War is probably the perfect example. Certainly within the US, they did the TV commercials with Kate Upton. They put them on the Super Bowl, which is the largest TV broadcast in the United States. Did a number of these things where you might look at that game and say it's actually for a very specific audience, but because the number of competitors advertising was smaller, they could do really mass advertisement and pull people in. And then something like Marvel Contest of Champions, where you put a big license on the game, and that really gets attention and becomes a way that you can acquire. So now we come to more of the maturity phase. Huge number of games, right? This is where we're living today. The App Store and Google Play are getting literally hundreds of games per day submitted. High quality, and you're starting to see bundled mechanics. So the best example of bundled mechanics would be something like Grand Theft Auto Vice City, where all of a sudden you had one game that had driving, shooting, flying, exploration, story, everything you could imagine, right? We're starting to see that happening on mobile where rather than a game being just one interaction mechanic, they're starting to bring in multiple. And the general quality of everything is very high. Very low organic rates. I think most companies have, and developers have realized that this is the case now. You're not going to get found. You have to get people to find you, and highly optimized acquisition. So lots of people with money to spend acquiring users, and people have become very, very good at it. This is why Facebook is an expensive acquisition channel now. This is why it's very hard to pick people up inexpensively. At this point, there's kind of three dimensions to trying to win. You can win on brand, so having a huge IP. You can win on retention, so being a game that people really get deeply into and stay with, and that becomes a driver of virality because they interest their friends. Or you can win on a massive budget. So if you're a company that has tens of millions to spend on marketing, you can buy your way into consumer awareness. These aren't perfect examples because we're just moving into this maturity phase, but Gardenscapes, good example of bundling. They took Match 3, they added a very light story and a fairly deep world-building customization, and then something new like Harry Potter Hogwarts Mystery, where they're going very deep into story, high quality, and with one of the world's biggest IPs attached to it. So where we are today, mobile is very much a mature market. Huge number of high-quality games. Bundling has started, but it's fairly nascent, and story is fairly world-focused. So you see a lot of, I think this is something Supercell has been great at, or Best Fiends. There was an earlier presentation that talked about this in a great way where you don't necessarily have story integrated in the game, but you have a world that has story behind it and you can tell that story outside the game. And we're seeing platforms reacting positively to story. So story continues to be a way to draw the attention, particularly of Apple. So why story? Why, in the face of this mature market, why care about story? It's expected by gamers at this stage of the platform. We see this in every platform. As we evolve, as quality goes up, story becomes something that people get excited about because now the games are deep enough that they want a reason behind what they're playing. It's a signal of quality, and we know it's an area of passion from other platforms. So mobile gamers are just gamers. They're playing on mobile, they're playing on other platforms. The only reason that mobile gamers haven't expected story on mobile is because they didn't think mobile was capable of it. They hadn't seen it delivered well. Now the quality is getting there. And so that's why the third point, when we went out and did consumer research and spoke to gamers in the US, the UK, and Germany, and among the highest spending segment of mobile game players, story was what they identified as the number one way to hold their interest in a game. And it's really interesting to think about because we know that very few mobile games are actually doing this. So this is them projecting in from other platforms they've played on and recognizing that story is something that will get them to become engaged and stay engaged. And then it's really foundational to brand building and creating virality. So if you think about the biggest IPs that are out there, be that Star Wars or Marvel or Star Trek or anything else, they all have a deep story that lets people get engaged in that world and those characters. So now let me talk a little bit about case studies. So this is a game we're developing called Animal Cove. That's Winston. He's sort of the main narrator of the game. He's a talking dog. He wears a tie. It's match 3 with world building. It's set on an island of talking animals. I think the biggest difference, so we've soft launched, we've had it in front of over 13,000 players, so we have a really robust sample size at this point to feel good about what we've seen. The biggest thing that's unique about this game is that we've made story a huge emphasis. So not just those little moments of conversation, but actually a real story thread that goes through the whole game. Fully 3D animated characters telling that story, voice acting to support that 3D animation. So as you play the game and as you experience those mechanics, it very much feels like a game with story, not just a casual game that happens to have a bit of story attached. So when we look at the players of the game, we think a lot about who our story players are. And we use a really harsh definition of a story player, but a story player is someone who never hits skip ever. So we'll have sections where there might be 4, 5, 6, 7 lines of dialogue back and forth, and we have about a third of our players who literally never hit skip. They read or listen to every single line of dialogue. And while on the one hand, you might look at that and you go, oh, well, 2/3 of players are skipping, right? And 2/3 of players are skipping something. But when we think about how competitive mobile is and how small the fraction of players tends to be that spends money in a mobile free-to-play game, if you're thinking about something that is deeply important to 1/3 of your players, that can be incredibly valuable. That is proven to be even more the case when we look at data about those players. So paying players are 17% more likely to be what we define as a story player, so someone who never skips. Story players play 23% more sessions, and story players stay with the game 21% longer. So again, back to my overall theme of really thinking about not just the emotional case for story, but the business case for story. Think about games you might be working on. What are the systems that you can integrate that are going to add 21% to the life of players, right? Because if I came to you with any system and said, integrate this and your players will stay in the game 20% longer, that's an instant yes, right? Nobody thinks twice about something like that. Obviously with story, there's a lot that goes into it. You have to write that story. You have to bring that story to life through art and through player engagement. And you have to integrate the story in a way that feels good. And yes, you do have to make that story skippable. This is one of the real pain points sometimes for us on the development side and on the creative side. We put so much passion into that story. We're so excited about it that the notion that 2/3 of the people are going to skip it is physically painful. But you have to make it so that for those who don't care about the story, it's not a blocker to them being in the game. But for those who do care about the story, this can bring them so much more deeply into the experience and really increase the value of your game. So the major takeaways, first off, the mobile market is mature. Don't kid yourself about this. The single biggest difference that I see, I've been at a number of companies, I've worked with a lot of external partners. The biggest difference between success and failure is a recognition that we are in a highly mature market, and the notion that if you build it, they will come doesn't work anymore. It really doesn't matter how good your game is. If you don't have a plan to monetize it and to market it and to keep players engaged in it, it's not going to be successful. It hurts to say that, but it's the truth of a market as crowded as this one. Second important thing is story creates opportunities for success. So as you're thinking about if you're a smaller developer, maybe you're only a few people, what you're weighing out is how do you spend your time. I would make the case that there is real value in spending time on story. If you're with a larger organization and you're needing to go in and make the pitch for getting resources, getting money, getting funding to add story, again, I would make the case that there's real demonstrable value there for not just the experience of your game, but the business of your game. And really that's because there is a demonstrated impact on value throughout the experience. I just keep coming back to, and we were actually stunned, as passionate as we are about story, now that we've had the game out long enough to actually get the metrics around it, we were excited to see not just the number of players engaged, but the real impact it has. And hopefully, in a year, we'll be going global with Animal Cove this summer. So hopefully I'll be back here next year and can tell you an even, bigger story, bigger sample size, a lot more about how story helps drive that success.
Hi, so you said that the game is going to have a full voiceover. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the story for me is very interesting, but as long as it has the full voiceover. So did you do some tests or some statistics about that, if you really need the voiceover?
Yeah, so question is about the decision to do voiceover in the game. So I should emphasize that it also is in text, so it's not relying solely on voiceover, because we know a large percentage of players either all the time or sometime based on where they are will play without audio. So we haven't done direct testing on whether voiceover is required. That it's something that I think will be interesting to investigate over time, and as we continue to go broader, to look at the metrics of how many players are playing with audio on or off. We did it largely because as we talked internally about what would really make this feel like a richer execution of story and really deliver impact, voiceover came up. Also with our history, so we've started as a PC MMO developer and publisher, and we have Wizard 101, which is just celebrating its 10th anniversary. So we actually have a very robust audio team internally that are phenomenal at what they do. So for us, it was also a little bit of a what's something we uniquely know that we can do well that might not be within the capabilities of other developers working on this kind of game. And that team was excited to get engaged, so we went ahead with it. But I don't have a great answer on, oh yeah, X percentage, or it provides this much lift. Unfortunately, it's at the moment a little more intangible.
Hi, so my background is in film. So before I moved into gaming, I was a filmmaker, and one of the things I saw was, that telling a story in a game is very different to telling a story in a film. And I was wondering if you had any views on that, and like what one of them. I mean, it's a very open-ended question, but just maybe a couple of key things that you think is different the way you tell stories in games as opposed to books or any other medium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that question of how is storytelling different in games is a really interesting one. I think the question then kind of even one layer down of how is it different in mobile gaming versus other gaming platforms. I think as we think about it, it's a lot about really thinking about what that play session experience is going to be for a player. How long do we reasonably think they're going to be sitting there playing, and in what way? And largely, again, it's sometimes one of those painful admissions. The writers want to write a lot. The voice actors want to say a lot. Our passion for story generally leads us to want to include more and more and more. But actually what we've focused on is keeping it very bite-sized. So it's not about, we try and stick to sort of 5 or 6 lines of dialogue back and forth as kind of a maximum within any one story moment. So that it's not time prohibitive for people, and then just really focus on threading those moments together using both the script and the visual. So that's the other thing is, because we don't know when people are jumping in, and sometimes you might be jumping in more to play match 3 or you're responding to a live event, and so we really try and make sure each story beat has a visual component to it as well, so that if you've not played for a little bit, or if you're just jumping in for a moment, you can kind of visually go, oh, I remember, that's right, they just repaired this section of the world, or they just updated this. I think there's a lot that, we certainly take from looking at games like choices or episodes, very different sort of content. Those have been very successful focusing on, like romance type stories. That's not our story, but heard some of those writers speak at other conferences, read a lot of those interviews and played those games, and seen how they're very successful with, very kind of quick hit dialogue lines in small bunches that then string together to tell a larger story.
So how do you think a story can transfer between cultures? Asian mobile games have been doing quite a lot of odd stories when seen through the lens of a Western player. Do you feel that will change as the market continues to mature?
I think so. I'm gonna stand on both sides of this fence and say, on the one hand, I think you have to make a story that you feel is powerful for the cultural region you're targeting. Historically, there are very different tastes within different countries. That said, the biggest brands, the biggest stories transcend, right? So I think it's ultimately just a question of time and of scale. When you look beyond gaming, you look to Hollywood movies, and again, something like Star Wars or the Marvel stories that are being consumed all around the world and have a huge amount of passion behind them. I was at the same time, I think you see within individual countries or regions stories that are really successful, and that can be, plenty of games, plenty of films, plenty of books have been incredibly successful by being successful in one region. I think when you try and create something for everyone, you create something for no one. So what I would say is make the best possible story for the region you're targeting, and just know that that doesn't ultimately mean that it's limited. As the game starts to transcend, others will gain interest in that story, and it can spread. But trying to write with a mindset of, oh, I have to make sure this appeals to everyone in the world, you'll drive yourself insane.
Hi, David. Do you have any analysis or tips on the best monetization for a story-based game?
That is the question of how to monetize a story-based game is a really good one. I think it could be argued my title for the presentation may have tricked people a little bit. My experience and my area of focus right now is bringing story into the types of games that are already monetizing in other ways, as compared to thinking about a game that is solely a story experience. So I think, I think there's kind of two answers. So for example, something like we're working on an Animal Cove, we're monetizing it in very similar ways to how other match 3s have monetized. And the story becomes a reason why you want to progress. So it creates urgency to monetize, because you want to, each time you beat a level, you get a key. Those keys let you progress story beats. So it's story as a driver of urgency rather than as something you are directly paying for. I think there are some games out there, again, I hate to keep bringing up the same examples, but, choices and episodes, and there have been some other really interesting ones that are great examples of other ways to monetize games where they're specifically focused on story without other mechanics. So that's, I don't know that that's necessarily a satisfying answer, but there we are.